This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 91 of Here's How for the 17th of September 2019. I got a big reaction to the Brexiteer I had on the last podcast, but things got a bit tense when I talked to one academic known for her staunch pro-European views.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Coming up on today's podcast.
It is complex because most of the public policy challenges facing the world today are actually complex.
Come on. Are you seriously saying that there's nobody there who's kind of happy that they don't have well-informed tabloid reporters banging on their door and asking hard questions?
Can I say that, in fact, as it so happens, the Commission is a more open bureaucracy than the bureaucracies of the member state.
That's coming up shortly. In fact, it's coming up very shortly because I won't have my little rant at the start of the podcast in this episode. For reasons that you'll hear, I'm going to put it at the end. I just want to first thank all of my donors on Patreon. I appreciate you all. For people who don't know, Patreon is a website that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests. If you think you could do the same as them, there's full details on the website. I have on the line someone with the most impressive CV that I've ever seen. Bridget Laffan is currently Director and Professor at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies. She's Director of the Global Governance Programme and of the European Governance and Politics Programme at the European University Institute in Florence. She was previously Professor of European Politics at University College Dublin. While she was there, she was Vice President of UCD and Principal of the College of Human Sciences. She's also an organiser of the annual State of the European Union Conference in Florence, which has a high-powered guest list with people like the President of the European Commission, the President of the European Council, and the President of the European Parliament. Lots of presidents. She was also the founding director of the Dublin European Institute and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. She was a member of the Fulbright Commission and has been awarded the UACES Lifetime Achievement Award, the Thesis Award for Outstanding Research on European Integration, and she's received the National Order of Merit Award from the President of France. Bridget, I don't know if there's a dartboard in the snug of the pub where Nigel Farage drinks his pints, but if there is a dartboard and if there's a picture on that dartboard, it's probably you. You're the type of academic, bureaucrat, diplomat that he hates. What do you think of him?
So Nigel Farage is what I would describe as a Europhobe. He's not a Eurosceptic. A Eurosceptic, in my view, is someone who opposes either the entire European project, it's a political project, or aspects of it. Whereas Nigel Farage cannot see any merit at all in what has been achieved in Europe in the post-war period. So he's a Europhobe. I think he has had an extraordinary impact on his own country. Without Farage, I don't think Cameron would have had a referendum, and without that referendum, then Brexit would not be imminent. So I think he is someone who has started at the fringes of politics, but someone who has had an extraordinary impact, a much more significant impact in Britain than he's had in Europe. He's regarded in the European Parliament as someone who's not serious. He turns up for all the photo ops, he takes the money, but he actually doesn't do any work. And so he does not have influence within the Parliament, but has had extraordinary influence, in my view, in the United Kingdom.
I disagree, I have to say. I don't think he's Europhobe. I think he's an opportunist. You may agree that he's an opportunist as well, but I think that opportunists take opportunities when they come, and without an opportunity, there is no opportunist. It's true, though, isn't it, that the EU has created opportunities for him in the sclerotic and sometimes very inefficient and corrupt way that it works?
So again, I think one has to, so I agree he's an opportunist. He's a populist and an opportunist. Mm-hmm. But in my view, he is also a Europhobe in that he is incapable of looking at the EU in the round and both what is right and what is wrong. And I think in a way what has happened in Europe is far too much political space has been granted to those views. Why do I say that? The EU is a political system. It's a very young political system, but it is debated politically in ways that one wouldn't debate the United States, for example. So one could argue the United States faces very similar challenges and its politics also have very serious problems. But one doesn't talk about the contingency of the United States. One doesn't talk about the disintegration of the United States. So the problem I have with what I call the Europhobic element is that they actually look at the EU in extreme terms. And the EU is a political system, and like all political systems, it operates on the basis of power, on the basis of values, and on the basis of preferences. And what the EU is, and there's, in my view, only one EU available, is the product of what could be agreed by 28 countries. So I can think of lots of areas where the EU should do more, but I don't see the political governmental...
Wait, pause with that. You say they should do more. Do you mean that they should improve or they should have greater competencies, they should have greater powers?
So, for example, with the euro area, in my view, you must finish banking union, because until you complete banking union, you will make the banking system in Europe vulnerable.
But that is central banks.
No, it would be a deposit insurance scheme that would back up the euro.
So that means if a Greek bank goes under because they've been lending money against some rock in the middle of the mountains in Greece, that the rest of the taxpayers of Europe should bail out that bank?
No, I think what there has to be is mechanisms available, in other words, pots of money available to be used in extremis to make sure that the euro area is secure. There are also those who would go much further and argue that you need fiscal federalism. In other words, you need redistribution within the euro area from the richer parts of Europe to the poorer. There is some redistribution in the EU, but in my view, it is limited and will remain limited because the EU isn't a nation state. There is solidarity within the EU, but it can't be as deep or as thick as solidarity within a state where there is
Pause for a moment, Bridget, because I know that you're very strongly a pro-European academic and that you've essentially been that way for your entire career, and you've argued very, very strongly in a whole number of different forums that. But it is true, isn't it, that there are failings of the EU, and even the biggest fans of the EU must admit that there are failings that have created opportunities into which people like Nigel Farage and other populists in other countries have wormed themselves. I actually think that they're not interesting people at all, because where there are opportunities, there will be opportunists.
So can I ask you, just be very specific with me. Mm-hmm. Tell me, specifically, what do you see as those failings? What precisely are the failings that you are talking about?
Number one, I would say a democratic deficit. That if you take the TDs in Dáil Éireann, I would say that a fair number of them wouldn't be able to name, if not the first name, at least the family name of the majority of their voters. We have a very, very close relationship with our politicians. That is extreme in European terms, but there is no country where powerful people are so distant from their electorate as is the European Commission from the people it rules. And people, a very, very powerful trope used by the Vote Leave campaign in the EU was to say that this system is undemocratic. And that might be wrong. No, that might be wrong in some very specific cases. But the sheer distance and the sheer difficulty of the average voter of understanding, let alone influencing the members of the Commission and their behaviour, is damaging in itself, isn't it?
So can I just, on democracy, democracy is both a set of ideals, a set of institutions and a set of practices. And democracy operates at different scales.
Yes.
The larger the scale matters. So you can have very intimate democracy in a small town, the Greek city-states.
Yes,
and
yes.
as you go up in scale, democracy by definition is different. We live in a world today where there are different forms of democracy, both representative, deliberative, and direct democracy, which is the classical referendum. Now, if I look at the EU as a political system, it is not as democratic as the politics of a member state because, as you describe, the scale is smaller. But if I look at the EU from the international system down, which is also valid in terms of benchmarks, what I see is a system of checks and balances, a rule of law, a parliament that involves members from the northern Finland to southern Portugal.
Sure. The parliament is very democratic. Unfortunately, it's not very powerful.
No, it is extremely powerful. Again, that's a myth. The European Parliament has received...
Can it propose legislation?
No, but that's because, and there's a reason, and I'll come back to that. The European Parliament has received, it is a co-legislator with the Council and is a very powerful institution. So what are the checks and balances in democratic terms in this system? It is a dual system of representing the peoples of Europe via the European Parliament and the states of Europe via the European Council and the Council of Ministers. And those are extremely constrained in what they can do. They operate on the basis of rules, procedures and institutions. Now, where does the Commission come in all of this? The idea that the Commission is unelected. Again, the Commission will have to be endorsed by the entire European Parliament.
Pause with that, because I understand, and there is an unsophisticated criticism of it to say that, it's just unelected bureaucrats, and I don't want to go down that unsophisticated route. But take by analogy the American presidency, and that's elected via an electoral college. That's an anachronism of history that's to do with the fact that when it was created, the communications were just not possible to have a modern type election that we would have today. But the effect is that American voters don't vote for the president. They vote for someone who votes for the president. And that gives roughly democratic results most of the time, and sometimes very undemocratic results whereby twice in this century, the person who won the vote did not become president. It is a fact, isn't it, that the more layers you put between the voter and the elected, the more problematic the system is. So
just let's stop there, because the EU has 28, soon to be 27 countries. There is no way, it is simply illusionary to think that that will not be a complex system of checks and balances, predominantly to protect states. And remember, through history, small states have always struggled to overcome power and imposition. And the EU is the best international system that small states have ever had in history. Much better than empire and much better than the pressure of large states. And so when you talk of democracy, you have got to also ask, what are the alternatives? I would, for example, personally favour the direct election of the Commission President to remove that person from the responsibility only to the European Parliament. But there is not at this stage, there may well be in future, a support for that by those who have power. And I go back to this, the EU that we have now is the EU that is available through the democratic politics of the member states.
Are you saying it cannot be improved?
Of course it can. Of course it can. But it can only be improved by agreement. It can only be improved by consensus.
Hold on for a second. The member state governments are very much more powerful, largely because they understand the system. And I'm always suspicious of complex systems because I suspect sometimes people make them complex in order to prevent people from understanding. And it is true that in the way that nobody knows who the Prime Minister of Switzerland is, nobody knows who the European Commission members are. They have no profile, even though they are very, very powerful, and because they can keep out of the popular imagination, and that is not good for democracy.
So firstly, you cannot have a European Union without states. So you can't wish them away. They are powerful, yes. They're powerful because they are important.
Yeah, but nobody's disputing that.
But then you have to have balances between the EU of the member states and the EU of the peoples. Mm-hmm. So again, going back to complexity, the EU is not complex to disguise or obfuscate things. It is complex because most of the public policy challenges facing the world today are actually complex.
Come on. Are you seriously saying that there's nobody there who's kind of happy that they don't have well-informed tabloid reporters banging on their door and asking hard questions?
Can I say that, in fact, as it so happens, the Commission is a more open bureaucracy than the bureaucracies of the member states. It has much more transparency built into it in terms of its documents. They're there for those who opt to follow them. The reality is most people, most of the time, just want things to work. Mm-hmm. The proportion of any electorate that is politically active at any time is very small. We happen in Ireland to have a very there's a high level of political efficacy in the society. The Irish talk a lot about politics. They discuss politics. They discuss politics at work. They discuss politics at the home. That is not the norm. So again, I'm not arguing, nor would I argue, that the EU there isn't a different EU available. But that EU can only be legitimized and be available if it comes through the consensus of the member states. It can't be willed into reality.
Sure, of course. That's true. But it can be blocked quite easily by powerful people who are on the inside track who know. And I'll give you a specific example, and you'll be familiar with the Santer Commission, which resigned en masse under the weight of its own corruption. What has significantly changed to make sure that situation could not arise again? So that was in, I think, 1999, they resigned.
So let's be very clear, the weight of its own corruption.
Yes.
That is a complete exaggeration. There was Edith Cresson, one commissioner, mm-hmm. and she was clearly, in my view, abusing her position. Mm-hmm. And she was abusing her position by appointing someone who she was having an affair with. It wasn't even big bucks. So this idea that the weight of its own corruption, in my view, is simply wrong in fact. Now, the Santer Commission could have survived if Santer himself had decided to use his power to kick her out. Mm-hmm. He thought he could weather it, and he couldn't. And in my view, it was a very salutary exercise for the Commission, because it was the first time through the Budget Review Committee of the Parliament where a commission had to go. But again, this language I really object to.
No, but hold on. I disagree. I disagree with this. Hold on for a second.
Well, I'm sorry. To argue that
well, let's put it in
weight of
context
its own
for Irish
corruption-
listeners. Put it in context for Irish listeners. The not corrupt Irish commissioner involved was Pádraig Flynn.
Yes, so?
Pádraig Flynn is not someone who has any respect in Ireland. And the fact, I'm correct in saying, that European commissioners have essentially immunity from prosecution in any member state.
No. Are you arguing that Pádraig Flynn was corrupt as a commissioner? Is that the argument?
Well, we know that Pádraig Flynn was corrupt in other matters.
I'm sorry. This is really dangerous stuff.
Can I give the reasoning behind that? Can I give the reasoning behind that, Bridget?
I'm sorry.
Because
do you know what? I really find this, I must say, I agreed to talk to you. Mm-hmm. I find the way in which you raise Pádraig Flynn, there is no evidence whatsoever he was corrupt as a commissioner.
I'm not suggesting there was.
No, but I'm sorry, but this is not what I regard as ethical interviewing.
Can I give the reason behind that then?
No, I'm really sorry. I think you are trying to make a point on the basis of something that is disconnected from it. Pádraig Flynn was the commissioner. Yes, Pádraig Flynn was found by tribunals in Ireland to have behaved, in my view, both corruptly and unethically. Mm-hmm. But there is no evidence whatsoever, none, that he in any way was corrupt as a commissioner.
I accept that.
It has no bearing on the point that we are discussing. None.
Can I say why I think it has a bearing, and I will allow you to tell me if I'm wrong?
Well, to be honest, I'm getting extremely uncomfortable with this discussion. I'm getting extremely uncomfortable.
Well, allow me to say why I think it's connected, and if you think I'm wrong, I will allow you to full rein to explain that. Commissioners have, as I understand it, immunity from prosecution in any member state, and it is also an extremely prestigious job. Politicians are very glad to get it. And the tendency is that it can be a useful kick upstairs for a prime minister who has a difficult senior politician that they don't want hanging around in their country. And that means that it tends to be populated with problematic politicians more than might otherwise be the case. Is that not a fair observation?
No,
Tell me why.
Because there have been outstanding European commissioners,
mm-hmm.
who have done extraordinary work in all sorts of policy areas and have rendered our continent more prosperous and safer, with cleaner air, with cleaner water. And to be honest, if you want to brand all commissioners, because that's what you're doing in this frame, not. Well, I'm sorry, but the frame is wrong. It is wrong in fact, and in my view, it's unethical. Because what you are doing is you are taking a group of people whom you probably don't know an awful lot about, and you are basically saying that they are kicked upstairs. In other words, you are dismissing an entire cohort of people since 1958.
No, I'm not. What I'm saying is that
sweeping statement. I really, genuinely am very uncomfortable with this discussion.
Let's park that in that case. I won't pursue that any further.
Because I think it's really important in a world where politics is in a very volatile and vulnerable place that we actually use language carefully, mm-hmm. and that we do not exaggerate. And we do not make what I consider to be unfounded blanket claims. I think facts really do matter.
Would you agree that in Ireland's case, appointment of the European Commissioner has sometimes been more to do with internal politics? That's to say, appointing someone who has the potential to be awkward if they were to remain in national politics?
You better tell me who those are, because in fact we've been broadly very well served by the people we've sent to Brussels. We have had Maura Geoghegan-Quinn, who was Fianna Fáil, did well in research. Phil Hogan is doing a very good job in ag at the moment. Peter Sutherland was an outstanding commissioner. Ray McSharry was an outstanding commissioner. Paddy Hillary, our first commissioner, was outstanding. So I just don't get what you're basing these arguments on. I don't see the evidence.
Okay, let's park that in that case, and I accept what you say. I'm looking at a quote from Cecilia Maelstrom, one of those commissioners, who said that the scale of corruption in the EU is, quote, breathtaking, and that she was able to document 120 billion euros per year lost, but said that the true cost was probably much higher. And the European Commission refused to publish some years back the EU anti-corruption report. Do you think people are justified in being worried about those things?
So every year, the European Court of Auditors engages in very, very minute analysis of EU expenditure. And it highlights where the irregularities are and where the problems are. Yes, there is misuse of EU money. But the misuse of EU money happens in member states. It doesn't.
By definition.
There have been problems. For example, the Stats Office in Luxembourg had a problem in terms of its tendering processes. And that was discovered and dealt with. And it was not good, because corruption in any political system, particularly financial corruption, is extremely unhealthy. But if we want to see the EU in the round, then the EU budget is less than 1% of the gross product of the member states. So it's in comparative terms very small. So if that's your issue, if corruption in the EU is the lens through which you see the EU, then that's fine. But it is only one lens and one part of the EU. And we can spend an hour discussing it. But I don't know where we go with it. They have an anti-fraud squad. They've strengthened the law. They do the inspections at the member states. Could they do more? Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's not. This idea that the EU is weighed down by corruption is a myth of the British tabloid press.
Can I just go to a quotation from Carl Dolan, who's the director of Transparency International EU? He said, "The gap between the rhetoric from President Juncker and Vice President Timmermans and the reality on the ground is striking. Now more than ever, we need a strong and visible commitment to tackling corruption. Rising populism and the weakening of the rule of law across Europe requires concrete action from the EU on fighting corruption." He was clearly not satisfied with that.
I'm much more worried about the rule of law.
Bridget, the reason allow me to expand on that just before you answer, because the reason I wanted to speak to you was because it was the connection between the two. Because I agree with you that I think the populists are a threat to the rule of law and a threat to democracy. And they have an opportunity to use those issues when they're not tackled correctly.
They're using migration as the swing
also
issue.
As well,
much
that's
more,
true.
No, much more.
Yes.
Much more. It has much more salience in politics. It is in terms of when you ask Europeans what worries them, corruption is not in the top 10. The link is with the populists in Europe have mobilized largely, not exclusively, on migration and on the so-called elite and establishment, but mostly on migration. So again, yes, the rule of law, what's happening in Poland, what's happening in Hungary, is very problematic. But the question is, would it have been better to keep these countries with weak histories of democracy outside the EU, or is it better that they're in? Much better for their people that they're in. There are systemic risks involved. They're not good. And the EU again struggles with the rule of law issues, because in the end of the day, what happens in the EU can't save a country from itself. It simply can't save a country from itself. So unless the domestic electorates of these countries take on their governments, the EU can make things more uncomfortable, and they should. In my view, they should use funding much more as leeway, much more carefully. Mm-hmm. But they can't sort out countries. It's not an empire.
I agree with that. I agree with that. And I think you're correct in what you're saying. I think you're correct in what you're saying. But I just want to pick you up, and you mentioned immigration, migration, and in perhaps a very uneducated way, because of course the EU doesn't have competency on third country migration into EU. That's down to the member states. And you said that corruption is lower down on the list of topics. I would suggest to you that there isn't a list of topics. There is a nebulous feeling that is self-confirming. And one of the elements of that is a feeling, and may not always be accurate, but there are accurate elements to it, that the EU is corrupt or allows corruption, and
I really think you're talking to the wrong person. I genuinely did not and would not have agreed to this discussion if I thought the entire thing was the lens of corruption. That seems to be absolutely the only lens you have on the EU. And to be honest with you, the EU has challenges with corruption, but no more. Don't tell me that the EU is more corrupt than the United States government.
I'm not saying that.
I just find the conversation unhelpful. I don't genuinely think we're getting anywhere, and I would prefer to stop.
Well, let me give you one very open question.
I don't want anything that we have said used in any way. Can I just re-emphasize this? You have no authority to use this conversation in any way.
Well, that doesn't have any purchase, but I mean,
I'm not happy with this conversation from the beginning. My fault. I should have asked you what it was about.
Well, my real simple question is, what response can the EU have? Clearly, the situation that we're currently in is a very difficult one. Can the EU change anything?
Look, I genuinely want to bring this to a halt. It's not been a good conversation from my point of view. I wouldn't have agreed to do it if I thought this was the tone, if I thought this was the lens that was being used. I wasn't told. My fault. I should have asked you, but I really want to bring this to an end.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
I just want to follow up on a couple of things that Bridget said there. The first point to address is where she said that she wasn't giving me permission to use the interview. That has no validity whatsoever. I told her very clearly that I was recording an interview for the podcast, and even if I didn't, I don't need her permission or anyone else's to do so. I can think of a lot of politicians who would like to withhold permission to report some of the things they had said. We don't have very robust media independence in Ireland, but we'd have none at all if anyone could veto coverage of themselves. But on the substantive point, the Santer Commission, which resigned en masse in 1999, in my view is a very relevant topic for discussion because the method of nominating commissioners has not substantially changed since then. Each government chooses one politician who they send to become a commissioner, basically a Europe-wide minister for something, in the way that Phil Hogan is the European Commissioner for Trade. As I mentioned to Bridget, commissioners have immunity from prosecution for any crime in any EU country. That's not so surprising when it comes to international officials like ambassadors. They couldn't work in other countries if the host government could harass them with frivolous investigations every time that they did something the host didn't like. But to get immunity in your home country, that's extraordinary. It does happen to a limited extent in other countries, but it's normally restricted to preventing legal cases regarding what they do in office. In this case, it covers all crimes, including any that were committed before you got the job. Bridget also rankled at my mention of the corruption of Pádraig Flynn, saying that his corruption was not related to his work as a commissioner. That's true, but think about that claim for a moment. Flynn was a corrupt politician, but it was okay for him to be commissioner because he was already corrupt when he got the job. And we haven't found any evidence that he used the commissioner job to enrich himself in the way that he did when he was a national politician. Is that really where we're setting the bar? And Bridget was flat wrong when she tried to suggest that the only thing wrong with the Santerre Commission was that the French commissioner, Edith Cresson, gave a job to someone she was having an affair with. A later inquiry found that she, quote, failed to act in response to known, serious and continuing irregularities over several years. She was found guilty of hushing up irregularities where vast sums of money went missing. And it wasn't just her and Flynn. There were serious allegations of corruption and incompetence against the Spanish commissioner Manuel Martín González as well. But my real beef is not with the individuals, it's with the system. We can take Flynn as an example because we know how Irish politics works. He was appointed European Commissioner by Albert Reynolds in 1992. At the time, Reynolds had only recently replaced Haughey as leader of Fianna Fáil, and Reynolds was looking to shore up his power base. Flynn was a major political figure at the time and in a position to make trouble for Reynolds. Sending Flynn to a big job with a big salary in Brussels was a good solution for that problem. And there were rumours, which turned out to be true, of industrial-scale corruption at the top of Fianna Fáil. Everyone in political circles at that time knew that, at the very least, Flynn was a person of interest in that. So again, sending him to a job where he had immunity from prosecution was a solution to a domestic political problem rather than a high-minded appointment of the best person for the job. Another nakedly political appointment was that of Richard Burke by Charlie Haughey in 1982. Burke was a Fine Gael TD and Haughey calculated, correctly as it turned out, that Fianna Fáil would win Burke's seat in the resulting by-election, shoring up Haughey's minority government. And Ireland is not unique in using plum jobs in Europe as a way to solve domestic political problems. Bridget said that some fine individuals served as European commissioners, and that's certainly true. But some have been appointed for the wrong reasons because the system incentivizes that. And that's a problem that needs to be addressed. Bridget is also absolutely right that there are people out there trying to talk down the EU in an effort to destroy it. But the solution to that is not to hide or deny the problems. If you want the EU to thrive, the best thing to do is to shine a light on those problems and solve them.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and follow Bridget Laffan at Bridget Laffan, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that, including my Patreon link, are at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.